The small town of Villisca, Iowa, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The streets were quiet, especially after sundown, and the biggest excitement was the Sunday church picnic. But on June 10, 1912, that peaceful image shattered forever when someone committed one of the most gruesome and mysterious crimes in American history inside a white frame house on 508 East 2nd Street. At first glance, the Moore family seemed like the epitome of early 20th century Midwestern decency. Josiah Moore, known as Joe, was a successful businessman in town, well-liked and active in church affairs. His wife, Sarah, was a gentle soul, devoted to their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They were a model family in the eyes of Villisca. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moores attended a Children's Day service at their church. With them were 2 neighbor girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who had been invited for a sleepover by young Catherine Moore. They returned home around 9:30 p.m. No one suspected that by the next morning, all 8 people inside the house would be dead, brutally murdered with an axe. It was a neighbor, Mary Peckham, who first sensed something was wrong. She'd noticed the Moore's house was unusually still. Joe would typically be outside by 7 a.m. tending to the yard or the horses. But that Monday morning, the home remained eerily silent. No children's laughter. No clatter of breakfast dishes. Just stillness. At 8:30 a.m., Mary knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the doorknob. It was locked. Growing uneasy, she called Joe's brother, Ross Moore, who arrived shortly after with a key. Ross opened the front door and stepped into the parlor. He took a few steps in and then stopped. The silence inside felt suffocating. Moving cautiously through the house, Ross went upstairs first. What he saw in the master bedroom would stay with him for the rest of his life. Joe and Sarah Moore lay in their bed, covered in blood, their faces unrecognizable from repeated blows. The room was dark, all the curtains drawn and mirrors covered with clothing. He turned and stepped into the adjacent bedroom where the Stillinger girls had stayed. What he saw there forced him to stumble backward in shock. He rushed out of the house and called the authorities. Within the hour, the small town was abuzz with the news. Sheriff Henry Jackson arrived along with Dr. Cooper, the local physician. As the house was searched room by room, it became clear the entire Moore family, along with the 2 Stillinger girls, had been murdered in their sleep. An axe, stained with blood and bits of hair, was found in the guest room where the Stillinger girls had slept. It belonged to Joe Moore. But what confounded the authorities most wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the eerie precision. All the victims had been killed while asleep. No signs of a struggle. Every mirror had been covered. The killer had even taken the time to cook a plate of food, which was left untouched on the kitchen table. A bowl of bloody water suggested the murderer had tried to wash up before leaving. Yet no one had heard a thing. News spread fast. By noon, hundreds of townspeople had gathered outside the house. Despite the best efforts of the sheriff, curious onlookers managed to trample through the crime scene, disturbing what little evidence remained. Fingerprint technology at the time was primitive, and the concept of securing a scene was still new. The investigation was compromised from the start. Early theories suggested it might have been someone close to the family, possibly someone with a grudge. Joe Moore had recently had a falling out with a business associate named Frank Porter. Others whispered about tensions with a rival church member. But nothing stuck. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer either had a key or had waited inside before the family returned. As days passed, attention turned toward a man named Reverend George Kelly. He was a traveling preacher who had attended the same church service the Moores had gone to that evening. Reverend Kelly was odd, slightly built, with a twitchy demeanor. He had a reputation for being mentally unstable. He'd left town on the morning train just hours after the murders, and strangely, had written letters to others detailing the crime before it was public knowledge. When he was finally arrested years later and confessed under interrogation, it seemed the case had been solved. But his confession was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. He later recanted, and the jury acquitted him. Decades passed. Other suspects emerged. William Mansfield, a serial killer who had murdered his wife and child with an axe in Illinois. He had been in the region at the time. Then there was Henry Moore, no relation, another axe murderer with a similar modus operandi. Yet despite multiple theories, no one was ever convicted. The crime remains officially unsolved. But the horror didn't end in 1912. In the years that followed, the house fell into disrepair, changing ownership many times. Locals whispered about strange occurrences. People claimed to hear children's voices giggling when the house was empty. Some said they saw figures in the windows. Others reported cold spots and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. In 1994, a couple named Darwin and Martha Lynn bought the home and began restoring it to its original condition, even removing plumbing and electricity to maintain authenticity. They turned it into a museum and offered overnight stays for those brave enough. Paranormal investigators from around the country began flocking to the home, claiming it was one of the most active haunted locations in America. Among those was a young documentary filmmaker named Daniel Brooks. Daniel had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries and had grown up hearing stories about the Villisca Axe Murder House. In 2012, on the 100th anniversary of the murders, he arranged to stay overnight in the house with his assistant and sound engineer, Jessica Hall. Their goal was to record any signs of paranormal activity. They brought cameras, EVP recorders, infrared sensors, everything. Daniel wasn't a firm believer in the paranormal. He approached it with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Jessica, however, had a few unexplainable experiences in the past, and wasn't as enthusiastic about being left alone in an infamous murder house. The pair arrived at the house around 4 p.m. on a chilly October afternoon. The sky was gray, and a steady wind rustled the dry cornfields surrounding the town. The house, though freshly painted and maintained, still gave off a feeling of unease. The creaking wood, the drafty corners, it felt as though the house remembered. They set up their gear quickly. Cameras were mounted in each room, with a primary focus on the bedrooms. An EVP recorder was placed on the kitchen table where the killer had once left a plate of food. Motion sensors lined the stairs. Daniel explained on camera that they would run a series of controlled tests, including silence periods, reading Bible verses aloud, and even calling out the names of the victims to provoke any response. Night came quickly, and with it, a suffocating darkness. The nearest streetlight was blocks away, and without electricity in the house, the only illumination came from their handheld cameras and lanterns. At 11:45 p.m., they sat in the children's bedroom upstairs, asking questions aloud. Jessica asked softly, "Is there anyone here with us?" For a moment there was only silence. Then the EVP recorder captured a faint giggle, too low for them to hear at the time, but chillingly clear during playback the next morning. At 12:30 a.m., while sitting in the master bedroom, Daniel heard footsteps coming from the attic crawlspace. He turned his camera toward the ceiling. Jessica, gripping the edge of her chair, whispered, "Did you hear that?" They both froze. The footsteps were steady, deliberate, like someone pacing. Daniel, never one to shy away from a good scare, climbed the ladder to the attic. Jessica stayed behind, nervous but keeping the camera rolling. As Daniel poked his head into the cramped space, the air turned icy. He shone his flashlight and saw nothing but old beams and dust. But as he turned to climb back down, he saw what he swore was the shadow of a man standing in the far corner, tall, unmoving, and watching. He scrambled down the ladder, visibly shaken. His skepticism cracked. For the rest of the night, they stayed close together in the parlor, listening to the sounds of creaking floorboards, faint voices, and what they described later as the feeling of being watched from every corner. The footage they captured during that night would later go viral. The giggle, the footsteps, a frame that showed a shadow moving across the hallway, despite no one being near. Paranormal forums lit up with debates. Some called it the most authentic evidence of spirits ever recorded. Others claimed it was clever editing or suggestion. But Daniel and Jessica knew what they'd experienced, and neither returned to the house again. What really happened at the Villisca Axe Murder House remains a mystery. Whether it was a jealous rival, a transient killer, or something darker that can't be explained by logic or reason, one thing is certain: the house holds a memory etched in blood and shadow, unwilling to fade. And sometimes, if you listen closely in the dead of night, the house seems to whisper the truth, though no one's yet been able to understand what it says. 2 years after Daniel and Jessica's chilling overnight investigation at the Villisca Axe Murder House, the footage they captured had made its way across every major paranormal YouTube channel and documentary series. People debated endlessly over whether the sounds, shadows, and anomalies were real or manipulated. But amid the noise, something strange had happened. Daniel disappeared. Not publicly. He hadn't vanished off the face of the earth, but privately. Friends said he stopped returning calls. His social media went dark. He declined all interviews. Jessica had also pulled away, giving only one brief interview to a podcast where she described the experience as something that followed us home. The host laughed awkwardly. Jessica didn't. It was late 2015 when Ethan Walsh, a graduate student in journalism at the University of Iowa, decided to write his thesis on the Villisca murders and their modern cultural impact. The idea was to dig deeper than most YouTubers had, to understand why this house still had such a grip on the American psyche more than a century later. As part of his project, Ethan wanted to speak to everyone involved in the most well-known modern encounter: Daniel and Jessica. Tracking down Jessica Hall was easier. She had moved to Des Moines and worked at a local museum. When Ethan finally reached her, she hesitated but agreed to a short conversation. They met in a coffee shop just a few blocks from the museum, where she now curated old photographs and town records. Her eyes looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. Ethan pressed gently. "I'm not here to mock you or question your experience. I'm trying to understand why the Villisca house does what it does. Why it lingers. You and Daniel. You felt something that night. Something that changed you, didn't it?" Jessica didn't answer right away. She stirred her tea, staring into it as though searching for the right words. "It's not just haunted," she finally said. "There's something wrong with the place. Something unfinished." She went on to describe how, after their visit, she began hearing voices in her apartment. Not just at night. During the day too. She said she'd find her cabinet doors open, chairs moved, lights flickering. It wasn't until she saw the shadowy silhouette of a man standing at the foot of her bed one night that she realized something had attached itself to her. She moved 3 times. Every time it followed. "What about Daniel?" Ethan asked. Jessica shook her head. "He stopped speaking to me. The last time I saw him, he told me he wasn't sure we ever really left that house." That sentence stayed with Ethan. He drove back to Iowa City that night in silence, but something in him stirred. He needed to know more. He needed to go there himself. A month later, Ethan made a booking. The house was still owned by the Lynn family, though now managed by a private group that catered to ghost hunters and tourists alike. He didn't tell anyone he was going. He brought a small camera, a digital recorder, a sleeping bag, and a notebook. His plan was simple: arrive before dark, set up his equipment, and document whatever happened. He arrived around 4 p.m. on a windy Friday in November. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees bare and clawing at the gray sky. The house looked deceptively small. White paint, shuttered windows, a front porch that sagged a little. Ethan stood on the porch for several minutes before stepping inside. The air was still, like the house had been holding its breath for over 100 years. He moved quietly, respectful of the space. The living room still had antique furniture arranged to mimic how it might have looked in 1912. The kitchen held a replica of the infamous uneaten plate of food. Upstairs, the bedrooms were simple, stark, and disturbingly cold. He set up his digital recorder on the kitchen table and placed his camera on a tripod facing the narrow staircase. He planned to sleep on the floor of the parlor. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. He read over his notes, jotted down some thoughts, and made a short video log explaining his reasons for being there. Around 10 p.m., He shut off the lights and lay down in the dark, letting the stillness wash over him. The floor creaked above him. But he dismissed it. It was an old house. At exactly 1:13 a.m., the digital recorder clicked. Then came a soft thump upstairs. Ethan sat up, blinking into the dark. He grabbed his flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the thick black. He walked to the foot of the stairs and listened. Another thump. It was coming from the children's bedroom. "If anyone's here, if you remember what happened, tell me." He waited. Nothing. Then he said, "Tell me who did it." Long pause. Static. Then a low voice on playback so faint he almost missed it. "He watched us." Ethan froze. The voice wasn't his. He played it again. Definitely a man. Raspy. The next morning he left. He didn't say goodbye to the house. He just drove home. 3 days later, he listened to all the audio again. Several more faint voices. Child crying. What sounded like footsteps running across the second floor. The phrase "he watched us" repeated 2 more times in different places. Then something he hadn't remembered recording. Near the end of the file, a short, chilling sentence in a child's voice. "He never left." Ethan turned pale. He hadn't asked any questions at that point. His recorder had been left running while he packed up. The voice had come while he was alone. Over the next few weeks, Ethan tried to research any mention of similar phrases in the original 1912 case. In a scanned letter from a local clergyman dated 1914, 2 years after the murders, there was a line referencing a suspicious man who had been seen in the church that night, sitting in the back row, not speaking to anyone, and leaving just before the Moores and the Stillinger girls did. The letter read, "There was something about him that chilled the soul. As like empty wells. I thought he was watching the children." Ethan searched local census records, hoping to find a name. Nothing concrete. It was like the man had no past. And then the dreams started. In them, Ethan was always standing in the children's room. It was dark. The moonlight spilled in through the window. And something stood in the corner. Watching. Always watching. He'd wake up sweating, gasping, feeling like he couldn't breathe. He tried to move on, but the house wouldn't let him. Late one night, while reviewing footage on his laptop, the screen glitched. For a split second, just a single frame. He saw the shadow of a man standing at the top of the stairs. No face. Just a silhouette. And in the reflection of the camera lens, his own terrified eyes. He shut the laptop and didn't open it again for a week. 2 months later, Ethan returned to Villisca. This time he wasn't alone. He brought with him a psychic medium named Rachel Vaughn, someone he'd met at a paranormal conference. She had no previous knowledge of the house. He wanted to see if she would feel what he had felt. They arrived just before sunset. As they stepped through the door, Rachel's face tightened. "It's not just haunted," she whispered. "This place is trapped in a loop. The pain here. It's repeating." Ethan asked if she could sense who had done it. Rachel walked through the house slowly, stopping often, her eyes distant. When she reached the attic, she froze. "He was up here," she said. "He waited until they were asleep. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't crazed. He was calm. Like he'd done it before." When they went into the Stillinger girls' room, Rachel sat down on the floor and closed her eyes. A moment later, she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. Little girl's voice. "He said he'd come back. He said it wasn't over." Rachel snapped her eyes open and started crying. "I didn't mean to say that," she whispered. That night, Ethan decided he wouldn't stay. He thanked Rachel, packed his things and drove away. As he looked in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw a figure standing on the porch, watching him. He never returned to Villisca. Today the house still stands. People still visit. Some for curiosity, others for thrills. But a few, those who've stayed the night, leave changed. They say the silence in the house isn't just quiet. It's listening. They say that if you sleep in the Stillinger girls' room, you'll hear footsteps pacing in the attic. They say a shadow watches from the hallway and that the mirrors are covered not to hide from spirits, but to prevent something from looking out. What really happened at the Villisca Axe Murder House may never be fully understood. But whatever entered that house on June 9, 1912, never truly left. And if you ever find yourself alone in that house in the dark, and you hear the floorboards creak or a whisper near your ear, don't ask who it is. You might not want the answer. Then came a voice. A whisper. A single word spoken near his left ear. Why? He spun around. No one was there. He backed away, breathing hard. Every instinct told him to get out, to leave, but he forced himself to return downstairs. He sat in the parlor with the lights on, heart pounding. At 2:04 a.m., he turned the recorder back on and began asking questions. He climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt like a scream in the silence. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel. The door to the children's room was ajar. He pushed it open with the edge of his flashlight and looked inside.
Me.